The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society presents this recording from February 22nd, 2025. Christina Britton Conroy is in conversation with authors David Blixt and Valerie Neiman. They discuss the challenges and pleasures of writing about historical characters that appear in Shakespeare's plays, such as history versus the bard's literary license, research on the times and cultures, the adventures of site visits, and much more. An exciting and interesting discussion for our readers and writers alike. Information about our chapter is available at our website link listed in the description. Our participants, their works, and links are also listed in the description. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Welcome to the Historical Novel Society's New York City chapter's panel discussion, Historical Meets Literary, Breathing Life into Shakespeare's Historical Figures. I'm Christina Britton Conroy in Greenwich Village in New York City. Thanks to authors Faith Justice and Susan Wands for setting up the Zoom and monitoring the chat. So today's authors are, in alphabetical order, David Blixt and Valerie Neiman. David Blixt's novels, particularly his Star-Crossed series, seamlessly weave together history, myth, and the timeless themes in Shakespeare's plays. His deep knowledge of Elizabethan theater and Renaissance Italy informs both his fiction and his work as an actor and fight director, bringing Shakespeare's stories to life on page and screen. Among his world travels, he has ridden camels around the pyramids, been thrown out of the Vatican Museum, been blessed by the Pope, sat in the prince's chair in Verona's palace, and dined with Dante's descendants. So welcome, David. And Valerie Neiman, soon to be released once upon, I always say once upon, it's not once upon a time, upon the corner of the moon, is the backstory of the Macbeths, the rightful ruler uniting Scotland in the tumultuous 11th century. Now, among her novels, poetry, and short stories, In the Lonely Backwater won the 2022 Sir Walter Raleigh Award and was a Forward Indies Book of the Year finalist. Blood Clay won the Eric Hoffer Award. She has held state and NEA creative writing fellowships, taught at North Carolina A&T State University, and currently teaches at writers' workshops. A member of Scottish heritage, she hiked in Scotland doing boots on the ground research. So welcome, Valerie. So I guess you two, first we need to know why these books, how did they come to be? And we all know that Shakespeare took creative liberties with history, turning reasonable historical figures sometimes into villains. And I'm wondering if our two authors were sticklers for historic accuracy or for Shakespeare's fake news.
You want me to start off?
Take it away.
Okay. I loved, Macbeth was my first play I ever went to. Love Shakespeare, love Macbeth. But I was doing research for another book, and in the course of that, stumbled across the fact that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth were real figures, but they were nothing like Shakespeare depicted. So I was fascinated, and I've been going down that rabbit hole ever since, reading and reading. And yeah, in short, I tried to abide by history. The problem with this period in the 11th century is the sources are few. And many things were then changed around in later chronicles, and that's where Shakespeare drew his figures from, as a result of later chroniclers tarring the Macbeths and uplifting the House of Dunkeld. So as much as I'm able, I have tried to follow the historical record, but I have had to do an awful lot of filling in between, because we know, for example, very little about Gruach, Lady Macbeth, other than her name and her father's name, and that she was married to Gilcowan and then Macbeth. That's about it. So it's a lot of interpretation, a lot of character building, a lot of world building, because of the lack of primary sources.
Okay.
I'm in a happier circumstance because Romeo and Juliet are absolutely fictional characters that Shakespeare stole from other people who stole from other people who stole from other people. And so I don't have to correct any historical records. So my play came about, or my story came about doing the play Romeo and Juliet. I was directing it for the first time, and I was, trying to figure out how many actors I need and all these things. And at the end of the show, Romeo and Juliet have killed themselves. Paris is dead, and all the families rush in and everything. And they're oh, wife, look how our daughter bleeds. And Lord Montague comes in, and the prince says, "Come, Montague, you are early up to see your son and heir more early down." And Montague says, "My liege, my wife is dead." And I'm sitting there going, why does Lady Montague die? Why do we care? Why does she? And so a death at the end of a play off stage is symbolic of something. Death is symbolic of an ending. The only thing that ends at the end of the show is the feud between the Capulets and the Montagues. So Lady Montague's death is symbolic of the end of the feud. The only way that made sense to me was if she was the cause of the feud a generation earlier. She was supposed to marry Lord Capulet and ran off with Lord Montague instead. Doesn't help the play at all, doesn't need to be done or anything, but I couldn't let go of the idea, so I started doing research into Verona, and I found out that at the time when Romeo and Juliet was originally set, which is the early 14th century, Dante was in Verona, Giotto was in Verona, Petrarch was in Verona, the Renaissance technically begins in Verona. So all of that became this kind of like, oh, I get to weave all of Shakespeare's Italian characters into this story because there's a 25-year gap between Petruchio and Kate in The Taming of the Shrew and the Romeo and Juliet story. They actually say that in the play. So all of these things, I got to bring all of Shakespeare's Italian characters together and then slot them into real history. So I made sure not to contradict actual history, but I'm having a lot of fun weaving Shakespeare characters in and out of the actual things that happened.
I think I hear a lot of us of weaving. We're like building this tapestry. We've sort of got, we've got some framework and then all of this invention over it, which of course is what Shakespeare did. Fun.
Exactly. And I'm like with the lack of knowledge about Groak's history, I am drawn to gaps. I like, oh, there's a hole there. I don't know what happened there. I want to fill that hole in, please.
Yes, yes.
So can we have an example of filling a gap?
A reading or just a discussion?
Either, whichever.
Well, I think for me, Gruach is just a name. And so I started thinking about what would be, what are these people like in reality? We do know that, for instance, that Macbeth was raised Christian, literate, was went on pilgrimage to Rome, gave a lot of money in ways that was unusual for his time. You didn't give money directly to the poor. Nobody did that. You gave it to a church because then you got your name on it. So he was kind of unusual. He might be rather almost pious. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. Well, what about her? Who is she? We know her father was killed. Would she have been in exile? If so, where? And I started thinking, well, it would be very interesting if she fled into the north and into what would be called pagan, or actually the ancient religions of Pict land and before, all the way back to the Neolithic. So she's raised in a goddess religion. So then when these two come together, there's going to be conflict within their relationship. And I thought that's really what's driving a lot of the book, is the conflicts between old and new, between the old religions and Christianity and versions of Christianity, the Roman versus the Celtic. And then also the idea between, oh dear, I lost my track. I lost the train in there somewhere. I'm talking too much. Between old and new about the succession, which is at the heart of the whole Macbeth Duncan issue. So yeah, I think Gruach was the one I had to do the most creating really a whole religion, which was a lot of reading on, goddess religions, the triple goddess, the ancient Mediterranean cults, and then just sort of building this thing and with whole cloth out of whole cloth.
Very similar. I mean, I only have so much detail about early 14th century Verona, but a lot of it comes from Dante. So what I ended up doing, because Dante actually mentions the Capulets and the Montagues, who were very real families that they wove the Romeo and Juliet story into. But in the earlier versions of Romeo and Juliet, they were not named Romeo and Juliet. They were named Mariotto and Giannozza. And so I took those names and gave them to the parents. And so I was like trying to do an homage to the original versions of Romeo and Juliet while setting it, backstory and all that. So as the feud begins, as the feud ignites with Romeo and Juliet's parents feuding, I have Dante in Verona, and he gets so angry that he writes the 15th canto to Purgatorio, which castigates all these feuds that are tearing Italy apart. And so I'm trying to find little links to places and times there.
Fascinating. I saw a question just come up on the chat. Susan, you want to? Let's see. Okay. We have a bunch
This is a question from Judith. Judith asks, Val, how did your travels through Scotland shape your novel? Was there a moment, perhaps in a thin place, where you felt a deep connection to the past that influenced your writing?
Oh, thank you. Great question. Yes, I, at the age of 59, decided I'd make my first through hike and took my backpack and did the Great Glen Way, and then did a lot of other hiking for a month. So I was on my own by myself. And that, of course, is wonderful for being open to these things that come through. The thin places, I was at Findorn, which is one of them, but the one that comes to mind really is Iona, which was, yeah, haunting, wonderful. Of course, Iona is the island where St. Columba first came to Scotland and established his monastery, and from there Christianized the Picts and onward. But at right at the harbor, sort of when you come in, is the Abbey, which is not 11th century. But what they do have that's very old is this giant mound, and it's called, and I may mispronounce, Rhaelig Oran, and it's where they buried the kings. Well, on this mound, which does not have individual gravestones, it's just a big mound, there are dozens, literally, of Norse and Scottish kings buried. The last ones buried there were Macbeth and his stepson Lulach, with Duncan and the others.
So
Now,
it went
Duncan's
on
buried.
that blanket and on the, just down in the crack of the leather. But that was not a problem.
Pardon me?
Okay.
Well,
Okay. Everybody. Okay. I'm sorry. Everybody, if you're not Hillary or David, please mute your. Please.
Hold on one second.
Valerie and David, please mute your speakers. Turn off your audio. Okay.
Okay. All right. I got just a little, I thought, well, what's happening?
Yeah, no, take your time. This is very interesting stuff. I've been to Iona. It's an island. It's hard to get to. It's wonderful. Yeah, yeah.
So to actually be at the place where these kings are buried, and to be in the place where Columba wrote, there's the hill where he had his little hut where he would write, and walking the island, walking over the top and going to the other side where he brought his boats in, but always sort of feeling suffused by this past. It was everywhere. And whether it was the wind or the sunsets or the corn crakes. I heard corn crakes on Iona. It was amazing.
What are corn crakes?
They're like a bittern. They're a bird that lives in the reed beds, but they're incredibly hard to see and they're rare. And they were making their, it's a weird kind of call, kind of like a crow, but they're very rare, and they're trying to bring them back. And I'm just walking out through the fields, and I could hear these birds. So all of this stuff, for me, it's very important to be in the place and to feel and to know what these places sound and smell like and feel like, even though at great distance. So I guess Iona was the one, but everywhere. Orkney, oh, I don't want to get started on Orkney. Orkney, just, again, amazing. And standing in a churchyard in Elgin, and they had Pictish stones on the graves, and they're out there in the rain, covered with moss and lichen, and I put my hand on one, and it was just amazing. I mean, I don't put my hand on museum exhibits. I had to keep them behind me, or I will. But this was out in the open, and just that feeling of deep time that then just sort of fades away. So,
wow, that's Wonderful. Okay, David, I would like to know what you did to get thrown out of the Vatican Museum.
My wife is in the next room laughing. She likes to say that she tells this story better than I do. She wasn't there. So my first historical novel that I read in my life, I hated history in high school, just as I loathed Shakespeare in high school. But I was on a road trip with my father, and he puts in Colleen McCullough's The First Man in Rome. And I fell in love. I was just like, oh, the history's about people. It's a new thought I'd never realized. And so I'm desperately in love with this novel. So I do all the research. I'm like, okay, I need to go find out all about these because it's about Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla. And as bad as a figure of history he was, I fell in love with the character of Sulla. There are two busts of Lucius Cornelius Sulla in existence. I'd seen one in Germany. It's him old. The sculptor actually devilishly put the wig on him and showed the real shoots of hair coming out from underneath the wig on that bust, which is amazing to me. But there is a bust of him, young and sexy, 45 years old, in his prime, beautiful chiseled cheekbones, all this. I'd seen photos. It was at the Vatican. So I get to the Vatican. I'm 23 years old on a big school tour. I'm traveling Europe with a college group. And I get to the Vatican and the hall of bust is closed. And I am devastated because they do rotating openings for different parts of the. So I'm on a floor higher, and there's a little velvet rope and a door, and okay, I'm going to go see. And lo and behold, I can sneak into the gallery above the hall of busts and look down, and I see the bust that I want. And all I have is this. Remember those disposable little Kodak cameras? I had one of those, and so I couldn't get a close enough photo. So when the guards caught me, I was hanging by my knees upside down from the balcony, trying to get a photo of the bust as close as I could, and that's what got me escorted out of the Vatican.
Okay. I don't know how we're going to top that story today. That's wonderful. Okay. So I personally am interested in dialogue. The Shakespeare is all dialogue, except for he exits chased by a bear. There really isn't much, stage directions or whatever in Shakespeare's plays. So I'm interested in how you write your dialogue compared to how Shakespeare writes dialogue for the same or similar characters. So Valerie, you want to start this one?
Well, I'm a believer, which I think probably the idea of plain speech. I mean, trying to make it so that it disappears, that you get the ideas without getting hung up on the yields kind of thing. So pretty straightforward. So I'll read a section which is where Macbeth meets Grouache. He's finished the battle. Her husband, his cousin, Gilcowan, had been in rebellion, and that didn't end well for him. So she is now at this point a widow with a child, and he's the conquering man. So they meet. I go to Forest soon, he said, each word chosen, to begin the work of restoring this land. Malcolm, I thought, remember that Malcolm has supported him. I crossed my arms to better conceal my leaking breasts. I must not forget that while he had freed me from Gilcowan's grip, he was also foster son and ally of my father's killer. An odd thing, he said, to be in this place. I was sent away from Murray as a young boy and returned as a man, but not as I expected. My family has been shattered. I do not have the support of many relatives. Father and mother gone, no brothers, no sisters. Many of my cousins are dead or at enmity with me. Most of my father's people who did not choose Gilcowan were killed by him or driven to destitution or exile. He looked closely at me. And this has been the way also with you. Without family, land, or wealth, I agreed, unable to hide the bitterness. I have gained power and wealth beyond my expectation, he said, and must use them with care. I had a son's right to vengeance and a king's duty to his people. Still, I carry a great burden of sin from this war. One act brings many consequences, I said. Revenge, power, wealth. A little blood let out to bring all these things. A little blood, he repeated, shaking his head. You have every right to consider me an enemy. Through my actions, you are a widow. You should hate the mention of my name, and I should fear the day your son grows to manhood. But I have found a true man here, Ruadan, son of a true friend, Conamail. He has told me how Gilcowan tormented you, affirming what was widely rumored. He paused and looked down at his hands and seemed to shift again. Not a farmer now, or a red-haired warrior, or a leader of men, but a book-bound cleric in his plain garments. It is with this understanding that I offer to take you as wife, and to accept your son as my own child, if that is agreeable to you. I heard the somber words as if they were echoes of a pledge made long before. I looked back far into the trees where a spreading patch of ground elder lifted white flowers on hollow grooved stems. Will you wed me, Ruach? I hung my head like a chastised servant, afraid of what my face might reveal. I would bring you no allies, only ancient troubles. There are better matches for a young king who is so favored in his lineage. Macbeth waited. My hand trembled and I hid it in the pit of the other arm. I feared this working out of vision, the implacability of promise, and his cool management of this situation, far too much like his grandfather. There should be no objection from kin or church, he said. Kin and king, I snapped back. The Ard Ri Alban will demand his say in my disposition now that I'm widowed. And why would he accept such a marriage, the danger to his plans presented by a union of the royal lines of Alba and Murray?
Wow. Thank you. That was powerful. Okay, David. Now, I emailed David earlier today actually saying, do any of your characters, your star-crossed lovers, have something the equivalent of a balcony scene? And
They
he
do.
kind
Yeah.
Okay.
So Romeo's parents are getting together, and I stole the actual scene from Luigi di Porto, who wrote the original Romeo and Juliet, and he had them wooing in secret in the church. Instead of a balcony scene, I took the church scene and transposed it here. So in the middle of all sorts of shenanigans going on one bright night, on the night they met, when she is engaged to marry Anthony Capuletto, she runs off to the church with Mariotto, and he reads her Dante, because that's sexy.
It is? Okay.
Had Pietro's search extended to the chapel across from the Scaligeri Palace, he would have found his quarry. The candle had lowered, but was still burning bright as Mariotto reached the second circle of hell. I began, poet, gladly would I speak with these two that move together, it seemed to be so light upon the wind, and he, once they are nearer, you will see, if you entreat them by the love that leads them, they will come. Giannozza was an excellent audience. Every now and then she made a small noise of delight that encouraged her reader to continue. The rest of the time she kept her breathing audible but not rhythmic, so he could be certain she was not asleep. Now she leaned forward in delight. Who are they? The lovers. Which? He's already mentioned Cleopatra and Paris and Tristan. Is it Lancelot and Guinevere? Be patient, chided Marley. All will be revealed. He read Dante's entreaty to the lovers floating on the wind and their pitiable reply. When asked to tell their tale, the man groaned as the woman spoke. Love, quick to kindle in the gentle heart, seized this man with the fair form taken from me. The way of it afflicts me still. Love, which absolves no one beloved from loving, seized me so strongly with his charm that, as you see, it has not left me. Love brought us to one death. Cain awaits for him who quenched our lives. These words were born from them to us. Mariotto paused when he heard a snuffle come from the connecting chamber there in the confessional, either side. So keep separate so they're chaste. Giannozza? He pressed his face against the carved grille that separated them. The door to the penitent's cell opened, and he heard the girl flee from it at a run. Oh, no, he thought. No. I've upset her. Was it my reading? Did I do something? Did I not do something? Should I go after her? She's Anthony's bride. How can I chase her? God, how can I not? The door of his cell opened. The gust of air made the candle gutter and then die. Quickly, the girl stepped inside and closed it behind her, engulfing them both in pitch darkness. She collapsed weeping into Mariotto's arms. What? Asked Mariotto frantically. What is it? What's wrong? It's so beautiful. She buried her face into his doublet, fingers clutching him in desperation. Mariotto sat rocking her in his arms and pressing the top of her head with his cheek. That he did not kiss her then was probably the single greatest act of self-denial Mari had ever performed. He desperately wanted to shift in his seat lest the girl notice how excited she had made him, but he could not deny himself the pleasure of her weight in his lap. And part of him wanted her to know how excited he was. Their hands roamed, they breathed the same air. As long as she wept, he daren't caress her as he wished to, but he could stroke her hair, her neck, her shoulders. After a time, the girl's tears ceased to flow. She pressed her face into his. I'm so sorry, Ser Montecchio. You must think me a foolish girl. Mariotto, he said, please call me by my name. And no, not foolish, never that. Do you mind if I stay here? She asked in a small voice. Mariotto found himself unable to answer. She settled in against him, and he smelled once more the sweet orange blossoms. He drank it in as the gods of old drank nectar. So, of course.
Bravo, bravo.
Of course, he's reading about Francesca and Paolo di Rimini, which is they're doomed lovers condemned to hell because, and in their love story, they seem like they're really sympathetic figures, but they're in hell for a reason. She is, I made this character very much Romeo's mother. She's in love with love. And it leads to ultimate destruction.
Wow. Okay. So any other samples, or shall we go to another question?
David, I just want to say I love Dante and the Inferno, and I used the scene with Paolo and Francesca in a seduction scene in my first book. So
it's so good. It's just so amazing. It has everything in it.
Wow. Okay.
We do have a couple questions. Do we want to address those now or later?
Let's do them now.
Okay, great. I'm going to start with Mrs. Vaughn. Mrs. Vaughn asks Val, is the entire novel told from Gruch's POV? Was that something you decided on before putting pen to paper?
Okay, and if anybody just came in, please make sure that your microphones are muted, your audio is muted. Thank you. Okay, Val?
This book evolved, and it's rather embarrassing to say, it took 30 years. I mean, in this day where people write books in a month, it took 30 years for a lot of different reasons. But I always had her voice as first person, but I knew there had to be other viewpoints because she is constricted by being a woman. She's not going to be on the battlefield. She's not going to be, in a lot of these situations. So it was her and Macbeth. He's actually told in third person. She's told in first. And then I have a third character who popped up and demanded to be there. And he is a real oddball because he's a poet seer. He's half in the other realm. He's enmeshed in a whole world of metaphor. Everything is seen in light of something else because that's the way they would communicate secretly, is that a letter was also a color, was also a stone, was also a bird, was also a season. And so they could use these as like this code. You never knew what they were saying, but they knew what they were saying. So he's living in this, enmeshed in this metaphor. So his voice was really strange and difficult and wonderful to listen, to hear that come. Grouch's voice came fairly readily to me. I felt pretty much okay in her voice.
Can I say that you pulled off Lapwing so beautifully? It could have been a disaster, and it's fantastic, and it totally drew me into that particular kind of world.
Valerie, just following up with that, Judith wants to know, this historical figure behind Lady Macbeth lived in a time when power for women was limited or hard won. How did you approach portraying her struggle for agency, and what does her story reveal about the women in early medieval Scotland?
Well, her story, because I did put her into this goddess religion in the north. So she's raised with a lot of agency. The ancient Picts were matrilineal and perhaps matrilocal. They just dug up some ancient Brits, and the husbands left their homes to live with their wives' families. The DNA shows that. It's like, wow, that's really cool. But yeah, definitely matrilineal. The kings were chosen from the sister sons along that kind of line. So she was raised in a place where the women were very powerful, and her foster mother was the devotee, the representative of the goddess, was the white lady in the north. And so she was raised in that, learned to become that in her own turn. So she's got a lot going on there. But even within Irish, Scottish, Pictish society, because these are all interwoven, women had been given more uplift than in other societies of the time. There was a book by Saint Adamnan, where the penitentials of Adamnan, I think it is, that lifted up women and that gave rules for how women were to be treated, and that they were to have, rights over their children and rights over their property. Now, if there were sons, the sons got the property. If not, the woman gained control. And Gouache probably owned her family property around Loch Leven, because she was kind of the last of her line. King Malcolm, grandfather to Macbeth and Duncan, basically killed off everybody. He killed her family. He killed Macbeth's family. He killed everybody to keep things going in the direction that he wanted. So she most likely was, in fact, the heir of the property and had control over it, and she made donations from it. So she had a fair amount just because of the nature of her upbringing and because of the nature of the beliefs in the Scottish society at this time.
David, there was a question for you in the chat about your quotes from Francesca in Inferno. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and so the quotes inside were Dante quoting Francesca as she's being tortured in hell. I took them from the Bob Hollander translation of the Inferno, which is my favorite. I read 3 or 4 different versions of the Inferno because at the time I did not speak or read Italian. When I started diving into all of this, it has changed my life. I sent a copy of The Master of Verona to Bob Hollander, and he wrote back and said, yes, none of these things could possibly have happened, but I absolutely believe that's how Dante would have reacted. So I took that as a great, like, okay, thank you very much. That's exactly what I needed to hear. The main character of the novel is Dante's son, and that kind of happened by accident. I didn't want to take sides in the feud between the Capulets and the Montagues, so I ended up creating, or not, utilizing a real figure who we don't know too much about. He lived in his father's shadow, but had a big family and ended up living as a judge near Verona for the rest of his life. So I'm like, aha, I'll take him and make him my protagonist, and he has quite a few adventures.
Do you like the John Ciardi version of Dante? The one
I do.
Prima?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's so many like wonderful like nuances here versus nuances there, and how you translate something is so it's. I mean, we see this in obviously in anything we read, from the Bible to adaptations of Shakespeare. How you translate it really matters.
I don't speak any Italian, but I know there's a saying, traduttore basically the translator is a traitor.
Exactly.
Words are very
It
close.
plays off the word traduttore and trattori, which is the translation is betrayal.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that's what, because you cannot, do exactly the same thing. There's no way.
So any idea, I mean, in 11th century Scotland, obviously it was a language that's no longer spoken. So how do you deal with that?
Well, Old Irish, you had the Picts in Scotland. We don't really know their language. It was some kind of British language, rather like Strathclyde and down into Wales. But they didn't write anything down. And that's one of the things that's I really played with in the book, was language and the power of language, whether spoken or written. So they only left these magnificent symbol stones with these gorgeous beasts on them that we don't know at all what they mean. Lots of interpretations of what they mean. But we do know, of course, that the Scots came from Ireland. And so they spoke a version of Old Irish, which then sort of split towards Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic, and they've changed much over the centuries, obviously. So I've, kind of based it on contemporary Scottish Gaelic, but it's obviously it's like Old English and contemporary English. They're not the same thing, but for it to be understandable. So I do in the book quote some old Irish. There's the breastplate of St. Patrick, which was when he was set upon by druids and magicians, that he turned his followers into a flock of deer and they were able to evade and go away. And so I just quote that entirely as it's been passed down. And I have some Gaelic sprinkled throughout, but I avoid, going on at any length with that because I think, people are not going to understand it.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking that even Stonehenge, people are still debating what was it for. So interesting. I think the Gaelic, the Celtic symbols. You're saying that we don't know what they mean. So okay, we've okay. Well, Susan, is there another question?
Not currently, but if someone would like to put one in, we'll address it right away.
If you have time, I'll circle back to an earlier question of yours about dialogue, because like Valerie, I do not want to use. I don't want to put on airs. I like plain speak. I don't want to. If I tried to write an iambic pentameter, it would feel like someone modern day trying to write an iambic pentameter. However, Shakespeare has a tendency especially in his comedies and his Italian plays. The more intelligent you are, the more wordplay you use, the more double entendres, the more rhyming, the more the alliteration and all these things. And I very much made that the rule for my characters. The more educated you are, the more intelligent you are, the more you're going to play with language. And so that way, I tried to honor Shakespeare's style.
Right, and I'm always surprised, like at the end of the scene, when suddenly there's a couplet or a bunch of couplets. Which is lovely.
It's funny at the end of the first scene between Mac and Lady Mac. She tries to end with a couplet, and he tries to break in, and she's like, "No, stop talking. We're done now. We're done talking. We're going to leave now." Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. Very nice.
I had a question earlier. I didn't get to who wrote it, but Valerie, what are the thin places? And David, do you have thin places in your writing as well?
I think I started to answer that, but I think I went awry because it's so easy. I get so excited. Thin place is the idea that the other world presses against it, that there are places around the globe where you can feel the imminence of another world. And two of them in Scotland are Findorn, which is on the north eastern coast, where I went and almost got caught by the tides, did not check the tide tables. And it's like, oh heck, because where I was a broad flat beach and then it had like a cliff. It's like, I don't think I can get up that if this comes in too quickly. So I made it out of there. But on Iona is one of the others. And yeah, everywhere I went on there, I just felt the presence of another world. And, it's so strange. I mean, I think you either open yourself to that or not. I shouldn't say, I don't want to be mean, but there were boatloads of people coming in off a tour boat, and I couldn't help because they were everywhere, and they were complaining, "There's nothing to do here. Why are we here?" And I'm like, oh, and I just fled as quickly as I could to get back to the silence and the presence that definitely was there. And I wish everyone could partake of it, but maybe we're not ready at certain times.
Wow, that's a great idea for a novel there of somebody somebody dealing with trippers. David, do you want to?
There aren't as many thin places in the Verona series. In other novels of mine, yes, I certainly, and I believe in all of that. But for me, the visiting the places were important to me to get this. There's so much layers of history. I mean, I invented things in Verona that ended up being true because it's built on top of Roman ruins. I knew that all Italian cities have Roman ruins underneath them. And if you go in anywhere downtown Verona and you ask to see their basement, they'll grumble and like, okay, because by law, they have to let you into the basement to see the Roman excavations underneath all of the buildings. So people are moving their cars off of the plexiglass so that you can see the Roman ruins underneath things. And it's amazing. The places are so important. Visiting the places, Valerie said it earlier, visiting the place is so important. My wife and I were there in 2002 wandering around with a couple of professors, and I saw this door that's waist high on a building. And I said, what's that? And they said, oh, that's the death door. And I said, excuse me? And they said, oh, well, if you died in the house, the living and the dead can't use the same portal. So they had a door waist high to carry out dead bodies if somebody died within the house. And that's where the phrase knocking at death's door comes from.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, wow. And so obviously that becomes a scene in the second novel because it has to happen that way. And being there inspires so many things that you can't even imagine. You see something and it just sparks the imagination. And so lots of visits to lots of fantastic places in Verona. There's a church outside of Verona that is a huge set piece scene backdrop for a thing in the fourth Verona novel. So all of these things, just seeing the places, they become magical because they fire your imagination.
okay. So how did you?
Can I follow?
Oh, please, please.
Because I think he's so right about that. What you don't know is there, but that you then go and find, or that you intuit is there. I went to Orkney, and there's a part on the mainland of Orkney where you just go from one ancient thing to another: the stones of Stennis, the ring of Brodgar, Skara Brae. And this was the point where I was thinking, the initiation of Gruach, where does she become the White Lady? Where does she have this contact with divinity? And it had to be there. And so I used the Skara Brae was an ancient settlement that was covered by sand and was blown free, 100 years ago. And it's amazing to be able to walk through it. I mean, they've excavated, and you can walk through all of these wheelhouses and chambers and see them. And so that became the setting for the initiation of being in one of these kind of places, trying to dig back. It's like a palimpsest. We can't see the past. We can see it's under there. And we have to intuit and try to figure out how do we get back to, what's not 2023, but what is, 15th century or 11th century, and what's underlying everything. So David and I, we've got to go and put our hands on it.
Okay, wonderful. So David, your other line in your little bio, how you dined with the descendants of Dante. How did you even find them?
I contacted, Verona has a Ministry of Culture, and I contacted the Ministry of Culture, and they put me in touch with a lot of different people. And one of them said, well, would you like to meet the Alighieri family? And I said, yes, what, please? It turns out, unbeknownst to me, my main character, Pietro Alighieri, son of Dante, the eldest son died, and he got bumped up to the role of eldest son. So he became the heir after that. He bought a vineyard in the year 1353. We actually have his signature on the deed for the vineyard and all that. The family still lives there.
Wow.
Right. It's amazing. And my wife and I went to visit. We've been a couple of times and we've stayed there. And the Count Sergio Alighieri, I mean, when we met him, he's, Italian, open shirt, cigarette, good to see you. Lovely to have you here. We had a wonderful time, and he gave us the family history, but you walk in and it's, marble floors inlaid with the family crest. And there's, oh, by the way, over there is the marriage carriage where the Cerejo family married into the Alighieri family. And over here is the stereo system and the plastic cube with his daughter's photos in it. And it's, it's a museum that's being lived in presently. And it's been wonderful to watch their prosperity the last 20 years because they got picked up by the wine distributor Massi. And so their wines are now everywhere. It's great. You can find some wonderful Cerejo Alighieri wine. But we were staying there about a decade ago because I was going over to do a book signing when they released it in Italian. And I said, okay, so we've done the history here. How did this place survive in World War II? Because, after Operation Nero, they blew up all the stuff when the Nazis pulled out. He said, have I never told you this story? I'm like, no, you've never told me this. How do but and I love this story. The Nazis were occupying the villa, and the order came in to blow up everything, and they were trying to save the villa. And he said, "Is there anything we can do to save this place?" And he got the German commander drunk, and he said, "Well, I have all these munitions. I can't blow it up. I can't leave it here for the Allies. I have to blow it up." And they said, "What if we drown it?" So they got all the people in the middle of the night from the village to come and take all these munitions and put it in the river to make sure it was unusable by the Allies. And the next morning, all the little areas across the area, across the field from the view from the high on the hill, is all these little villages blowing up, and they got to keep the Cerejo Alighieri. So it's still there to this day. The history, just the length and breadth of one place astonishes me. I love the depth of history can go in just in one location.
That's amazing, amazing. And I think they were, now I'm thinking they were on 60 Minutes or one of those shows. They actually did a piece on the family, now that you're reminding me. So you're talking about kind of spiritualism, mysticism, whatever. And of course, you can't think of Macbeth without thinking of the three sisters, the three witches, whatever. So Valerie, do you want to talk a little bit about how they influenced you, didn't?
As I said, Macbeth's my favorite play. My dad took me to see it when I was a tweener, and I was absolutely enchanted. I mean, I came from rural Appalachia. We didn't have theater. And so my first encounter with theater was this play. And so I've always loved it. And The Witches, of course. I just went to see the production at the American Shakespeare Company in Virginia. And just all of the different ways of interpreting. But I didn't want to have witches. And so my version of it is quite different. Would you like me to read that scene?
That would be great. Sure. Thank you.
This is where Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are going in some ways to come together, because she's a representative of the White Lady and the ancient goddess, and he's a Christian. And so this is in conflict. So when he meets this figure on the hard heath, it's going to set up conflict throughout the rest of the books. Get the right piece here. I don't want to go too long, so let me start just saying that he's come from the battle. He's headed to join the king at Forres. The first faint stars showed as he crossed the wastelands towards Forres, marked by the blur of smoke above twin hills, a wooded one to the south, and what had been his father's fortress on its bald height above the river. The hard heath seemed boundless, a sea, and on it his horse a rocking boat. Seabirds whirled overhead, and gorse and heather and reclining berry plants crested and fell in waves. Birds erupted from the tangles, crying over hidden nests. Cut banks showed where the turf had been taken, 3 steps leading down into each cutting to avoid the curse of the saint who had fallen into a peat cutting and could not climb out. He saw a person walking, a thin motion on the wide earth. Slowly, as they approached one another, the figure grew and became a slender young woman, walking freely with her blonde hair loose on the wind. She carried a large flat basket such as women used for gathering. "I greet you, son," the woman said. She was older than he had thought at first, her long hair streaked with gray. Perhaps she was moon-touched, wandering. "Your greeting is welcome," he said. "Do you live close by here, mother?" She turned around on her heel, her arms wide. "Son of this soil, you well know my place." "How do you know my birth?" "Macbeth, the son of life, you count yourself the son of Finlay, who is son of the Red One. I remind you that you are the son of Duada, who was the daughter of Kovla and daughter of Ete the Sad." And he saw her change, her first willowy appearance cramped down by age, and now she was bent and her hair thin, white, straggling. Her eyes remained a sea-washed blue. He remembered tales of the Sidhe and Duncan's fears, the ancient walking women, the washing women, the keeners at unseen deaths. Lost souls, the monk Oswald called them, bred by fallen angels on the daughters of men in the time before the flood. Macbeth crossed himself. May the protection of Jesus the Christ be upon me. And that of Mary, his holy mother, the woman answered, smiling, growing younger. The basket was a cradle, and in it a newborn baby, and both of them were surrounded by light like sun in the haze on the sea. All around their light was soft darkness, and a crescent moon gleamed under her feet, and stars crowned her head. He knelt. She held the broken body of the Savior in her arms. Aged by grief, she laid him in the ground. Her son rose and lived and stood beside her, and she was young again and again and again. And then there was only her, a simple woman in a farm wife's garb, with the salt wind in her unbound hair. The sun rode in a new sky. Macbeth felt fear tighten around him as it had not in the battle, not even when the Westfold man's axe swung whispering by his neck. Son of this place, she said, you will be rewarded for valor with the land where you were born, a part at first, then the whole. Finally, all Alba will be your portion. He shuddered as though at crossing his own grave. Remember the people who were already in this land when your forefathers came here. When you are king, twice king, remember our meeting. Remember the White Lady.
Ooh, I want to see that on screen, that scene. That's amazing. That's beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you.
David, do you have an equivalent?
No. No, it was fantastic. And the witches fascinate me. I am writing a piece inspired by the witches, but has nothing to do with Macbeth. I'm interested in the curse that they put on the poor sailor when his wife wouldn't give chestnuts. So I'm writing a little something based on that. It's fascinating how much the witches have affected our society to this time. Obviously, he wrote an iambic pentameter, and he wrote the witches in trochaic tetrameter, so it's antithetical to the human heartbeat to show that they are unnatural. But he did this because King James was obsessed with witches and wrote the book on how to persecute witches. And that leads to, that's the book that was used for the Salem witch trials and how to find witches here. And so this one little piece of this is a very small microcosm of all the society persecution of women and all of this misogyny that comes down to us because of King James. And following through. The witches are a fascinating construct, and I love, by not putting them in there, how you dealt with that.
Yeah, I always, that's King James. I mean, whenever I'm afraid of the rare times when I will be in a conversation with some Bible belter and they talk about the King James version of the Bible being the true Bible, and I say, well, who wrote it? And then I say, what's on page 1? And they say, oh, the first thing's in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And I said, no, no, no. The first page says to the honor and glory of King James. So anyway, that's interesting.
Translations in the Bible continue to fascinate me. My favorite, of course, being the mistranslation about 1,000 years ago that Moses came down carrying the tablets and he had horns on his head. They mistranslated halo. And so medieval and Renaissance art has all these depictions of Moses with horns on his head, which is just bizarre and weird. What? But just the translation.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Now, David, you're a fight director, so you know how to do that stuff. And in your novel, of course, my God, the battles are huge and forever and complicated and like, my goodness. So talk about that a little bit.
All violence is a story of desire and denial. I want something from you, no, you can't have it. So taking that as its core for it, and if you can write a good fight scene, you can write a good sex scene and vice versa. It's all about desire and denial. For me, I actually stole a trick from Tom Clancy where you have tiny little sections and you change, and it feels like you're adding momentum. If you have tiny sections and then change the point of view and change the point of view, it feels like there's momentum. And so it is a way of, it's a cheat. It's a cheat. As a way of making the reader feel they're being propelled along in the story. So I changed point of view a lot during the battle, like, oh, this is happening over here. Oh, this is happening over there. For moves, the problem I've reached at this point, 10 novels in to my career, is that I'm very much running out of new ways to tell fight stories. I'm trying to figure out what terrible dilemma can I put these people in now to make it fresh and interesting, because I hate repeating myself. So that is my biggest problem. So I'm finding all sorts of weird historical facts about weapons that they used. I am fascinated by the fact that through the time that Christianity came into the fray, up and through almost to Shakespeare's time, the broadsword,
he has one
broadsword was our weapon of choice. And it was our weapon of choice because it was also our symbol of faith. It is a cross. Whereas in Muslim countries, they used a crescent blade because it's the symbol of their faith. It's not because either is a better weapon. This is better on foot. The crescent is better on horseback. This is much better for stabbing. That's better for cutting. And it is, so it's all about symbolism. It's all about, we're making a statement about something through how we choose to fight. And that fascinates me. And so I'm interested in historical warfare and also the storytelling of it.
Right. So so in Verona, obviously they were Christians, so they were using those weapons.
Yep, you're using broadswords, but they're also using misericords or heart's mercy, so you can slide that dagger in between the armor and pop their heart and lungs, and then rob them and move on to the next person. They were very inventive. My favorite weapon that I picked up in Florence one time was a dagger with a tiny little pistol attached to it, so you could shoot them while you're stabbing them. People were trying to invent all sorts of new ways to kill each other. They were being very inventive.
Oh, we still are, unfortunately. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. So pistols. So okay, I'm not that. When were
gunpowder showed up at the very beginning of the 14th century. They had an exposition in France in 1325 of a pot of fire where they were shooting arrowheads out of a pot that they could put the gunpowder in and ignite and shoot it across somewhere. So it was brand new at that time, and they still had not figured out. They were thinking, arrows, this is like, we can really shoot an arrow really far. They hadn't figured out bullets yet.
Amazing, amazing. So Valerie, back in 11th century Scotland, well, they certainly would have had swords.
Well, this is my, I mean, I'm fine with doing the herb lore. I'm into that. That's easy for me. Battle scenes. Oh, David, I need your help. I'm doing my best. But I do not have your depth. Well, the battles in this time period, Shakespeare himself, of course, went wildly out of his period. People had cannons when they didn't have cannons and stuff like that. But staying to what they did have, basically things hadn't changed a great deal from the time of the Romans. It was the broadsword and the lance or spear, depending on whether you were throwing it or thrusting it if it was heavier. Those were still the same. And the battle tactics, I think people have this image of of course, King Arthur in the Middle Ages, and everybody wore plate armor and huge helmets, and they had horses covered with caparisons, and they, fought on horseback with lances, which they did at one point. Of course, in Verona, they're doing jousting. But at this time period, the Scots and the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, none of them fought on horseback. Horses were the way to get you there, and they were very valuable, but they didn't have jousts, and you didn't have cavalry charges. Oh, I love seeing this, where you've got, a huge army, and they're all dug in with their spears waiting, and here come the horsemen charging into the spears. And, you can maybe jump over the first rank, but there's another one, another one, another one. And yeah, horses will be dead, and you will be dead too. So they would fight on foot. They would dismount and fight on foot with sword and with spear. And so trying to, which I think is a lot of what we deal with, there are people's expectations. Were they wearing kilts? No. Were they using fighting on horseback and plate armor? No, they were not doing that. And trying to build a world that is accurate to what was going on then, without so wildly, I don't want to say offending, but people are looking for certain things. How do you make them see differently without turning them off so entirely. I mean, it's like, no, this is not, Braveheart. Braveheart isn't even Braveheart. So, trying to be accurate to what was used. And that's what's great to go to the National Museum of Scotland and just look at all those arrowheads and all those spears and all those swords and get a sense of how much they were alike and how much they were different over a very long period of time.
Yeah, I love Braveheart. I'm also very heavily into early music. And actually one of my favorite consorts is playing a program I'm working, the Alba Consort in New York. But in Braveheart, bagpipes are hugely used. And then when I got to the Bagpipe Museum in Glasgow, realized they had not been invented yet at the time of Braveheart. So whatever. But
Well, and Braveheart, by the way, that battle scene, as visceral as it is one of the worst edited movie battle scenes ever, because he's running and he's got a sword and then he's got an axe, then he's drawing the sword, then he's got the axe again, and they're just cutting back and forth. It is fascinating to me to watch, just because we don't catch it the first time. It's only because I've seen the movie a few times that I'm like, oh yeah, the fight thing. And of course, they could have used arrows. The arrows were invented, but because the church was against that, because it's egalitarian, anybody could shoot anybody with an arrow, and they didn't like that. It wasn't until Edward III comes around and starts using archers for real in his battles that the world shifts away from knights on horseback and all of the heavy armor and all that stuff, because it's not useful anymore, because you can be shot off your horse at a distance and there's no point getting close. But the church was very against it. Church was okay with crossbows, but up until the mid 14th century, the church was very against bows and arrows.
There's another part of this in that the Scots and the Irish, where they live is extremely rainy. Mm-hmm. And so if you had a bow and the bowstring got wet, your power is gone. So they didn't tend to, the longbow, the English longbow, when that came along with Edward and onto the, Agincourt, etc., they actually had cases for their bows to keep them dry, because you just couldn't have this wet bow. It's just not going to work. So they didn't use archery even before the church put in a prohibition. It just didn't work up there in those northern realms. They used it for hunting, but not so much for battle.
I'm just going to throw this in here. Peter wants to know, since we're talking weaponry, what about the mace?
Not so much in my time period. It was more the axe. The Viking axe.
Axes are great, but maces are big metal clubs that you can beat people with. It's a great time.
But they came along later, like in your period, right?
Yeah, they were totally into use in my period. Yeah, and they become very popular. They come down from Germany, and everyone just likes hitting people over the head with a big, heavy thing.
Delightful. Okay, but I never knew that. I never knew that about arrows. That's fascinating that the church, any other prohibitions the church had for or against weapons?
Interesting. What else were they against? Okay. Nothing leaps to mind at the forefront.
The whole idea of chivalry, that you didn't act certain ways. I mean, you have that heavily in your book with, the knighthood and the things that you're supposed to do as a knight and things you can't do and everything. That was new. Before that, it was pretty much, if you could hit somebody and kill him, you hit him and killed him. And there wasn't elevated chivalry put on the top of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was new, and it was coming out of the poetry. Everyone, all of the poets that come out in the 12th and 13th century that create the idea of chivalry, and it's because men were behaving very badly. So let's give them some rules and try and give them something to aspire to. In terms of violence, the thing that's always fascinated me most is the relationship between violence and dance. The violence of a period is always reflected in the dance of a period. When you have giant broadswords and you're swinging like this, men and women dance the reel, go from partner to partner the way you would as you're slicing this way. In Shakespeare's time, you're fighting with a weapon in each hand. You've got a sword in this hand and a dagger in this hand. So you're stabbing and you're blocking, you're stabbing, you're blocking. And Renaissance dancing is partner to partner like this. And then when you get to small sword, which is basically modern day fencing, the dance of this time period was the waltz. The exact same footwork that's in small sword fighting. And then we invent machine guns, and everyone on the dance floor in modern times looks like they're being shot, and we no longer partner dance. And so the violence of a period is always reflected in the dance of a period, because men were always in training.
Oh, I think that's fascinating. There's an Irish saying that you don't give a boy a weapon until you've taught him how to dance.
Yes, I did not know that one, but yes, that's great.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we think of it in terms, when I first heard, I thought, oh, that you're going to teaching him to be graceful and peaceful first, and then you give him the sword. No, it was training. It was all training.
Footwork, yeah. Fascinating. No, that's wonderful. Boy. Yeah, I do historical dancing, and it never occurred to me that I was mirroring being in battle. Okay, how about, well, of course, the clothes would have to do with how people are moving and the fabrics that they're wearing. So thoughts on that?
Well, I brought up kilts, no kilts. In this time period, again, people looked pretty much alike, whether you were Scot or Norse or Anglo-Saxon. They wore a plain garment called a liney made of linen or wool, and it hung down, and you belted it up. And depending on whether you were, someone who was going to be at a feasting hall, or if you were out on the battlefield, you put it where it needed to be, covered by perhaps an overtunic, or if you were a fighting person, you'd have a padded and leather covered and maybe metal covered sort of jerkin kind of thing. And then they had various over tunics. If you were nobles, you'd have things over this that were beautifully embroidered and had jewels and all of these kind of things. And over that, a great cloak, a brat, that was fastened always at the left shoulder for a man and in the center for a woman. So they looked very much alike. It was kind of, now they talk about quiet luxury. It wasn't that the clothes were cut differently. It was the quality of the cloth and the ornamentation that was the difference, rather than being wildly different in style. Shoes were very primitive, just leather, sort of laced up. Really didn't have boots at this period. So it was kind of a flat footwear, and chain mail, no plate mail, and helmets. The Vikings, that not with horns, no horns. They didn't wear horned helmets. But the idea of the conical helmet with the nose piece, maybe cheek pieces, not as elaborate as the Romans that we think of, but very serviceable, so that you could still see and you could protect the main part of your face from being lopped off, hopefully.
Okay, so chainmail came before flat.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because it seems chainmail would be harder to make.
It's laborious, making all the little, but
Yeah.
you can make that, you can make that sitting by the fire on those long winter nights. They can be fashioning ring by ring by ring mail, compared to plate armor is quite different in the kind of metal and the shaping of the metal and all of that. And then we get into the very elaborate plate mail before it was kindly done in by the cannon. Some of those, where did I see those? In Paris, the Invalides, the just rank after rank of these gorgeous armor made for everyone from little, the little boy would have armor made for him at that size, and they would go on and on and on up. And I've not seen it, but the armor for Richard with his hunchback. I mean, he was twisted, he had scoliosis, and the armor was built to fit so that he could fight despite the fact that his body was twisted.
Yeah, David?
Well, one note about the helmets that you're talking about, because I mean, obviously you needed to be protected by the people next to you, because you had no peripheral vision. You had none, right? Your vision's cut off right here. So you're absolutely right about chainmail in the medieval era coming before plate mail. We had regressed from the Roman breastplate and the leather skirts and all of those things, because it is harder to forge, and with a decrease in technology and the loss of that skill, we start going back to things like chainmail and whatnot. You always wore your padded thing underneath it, sometimes padded with cotton or cloth or tallow or whatever it is, to blunt the force of anything underneath your chainmail. So you don't just put the chainmail on. And man, the cover of my novel, they chose this image of this guy with this sword, and I feel so terrible for this person, because he's wearing chainmail without anything underneath it. He's bare chested underneath that. I feel so badly for this actor, whoever they took a photo of that, because that must chafe like nobody's business. So in my period, it's very much, I mean, men wore long gowns. But the young men were just beginning to discover the doublet, and they're cutting off the doublet a little higher, show off a little more leg, a little more butt, just right there. And we're going to get into the era where they're all wearing their nice hose, and so their party colors hose. So you got one color on one side, one color on the other, show off the leg. They'd pad their calves to look sexier, more manly. Yeah,
had other things too.
Right, pad other. Well, they had their cod pieces eventually, and and compensating for things. And they also ended up wearing a lot of high heels, both to get through the muck in the road, but also to show off their legs better. And of course, we're at the era where if you are a woman with your hair down, you're either young or not an honorable maiden. And once you get old enough that you need to put it up and cover all of your hair and not let it be seen. And it is about quality of cloth and all those things, but we're in Italy. They're going to show off their skills and their colors.
And David, there's a question here from Peter about what about those big ruffled collars? They don't look practical for any reason.
My wife could answer that faster than I can. I hate wearing ruffs. I hate them. I've been a number of Shakespeare plays that I've been forced to wear one of these things, and that's later than my period. Thankfully, it's much past. That's Shakespeare and beyond. Jan, why did they wear the ruffs?
I thought that was Queen Elizabeth because she had a wrinkled neck and she invented it.
Coverage, but it's also, think about like in the 19th century when men were wearing the fake collars so that it kept their shirts clean.
Oh, the rough collar keeps your shirt clean as well. You have this there, and it keeps your dress from getting stuff dropped onto it. All these things.
Like a giant.
So I'm fascinated. You said it never occurred to me that married women covered their hair like for modesty.
The biggest insult you can do to a woman certainly in Shakespeare's era, in the Elizabethan era, is to snatch the hat from her head, because that shows that she is a whore. That is the opposite right there. Once you take that hat off, you're accusing her of being a loose woman. And that's go straight for the hat. All these women in law cases, they take each other to trial for tearing each other's hats off and casting aspersions upon their modesty. And it's fascinating how that lasts to today. I mean, women snatching each other's wigs off and things like that. How history repeats itself.
The scene that I read where her hair is uncovered and loose. In that period as well, women's heads were covered. They wore not as elaborate as later headpieces, but they wore a veil, a scarf over their hair. So the fact that her hair was loose, she was either a woman of no repute or she was crazy, because her hair was loose and unbound. And he notices that more than once, comments that her hair was unbound.
Right. I love your term. She was moon touched. Was that the term?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She was in some way insane.
Yeah. Speaking
also to the idea of what you wore, I love the idea of the doublets getting shorter and shorter, so you could show more and more of your knees, your thighs, your butt, all the way. See all of this lovely territory. The Scots and the Irish. One thing that people, they didn't in many occasions wear, the whole idea of kilts. They didn't wear pants, and people are like, well, how could you stand not to wear pants? It's cold, it's wet. But have you ever tried to run in wet pants? Because they slap into each other, and all of a sudden, so they wore, their clothing pulled up, and then the shoes and the hose could be removed and cleaned, but you weren't dragged down by these heavy wet pants as you ran through the bogs. And the Vikings took note of this, and one of their kings was named Harold Barelegs. Because they tended to wear longer pants. And when he was in Scotland, he saw that they did not wear the long pants and that it was actually very efficient fighting in the rain and the mud. And so that became his name, like Harold Bluetooth. He was Harold Barelegs.
Fascinating. Okay, if anybody has come in and hasn't muted their microphones, please do. If you have a question, put it in the chat. Susan, we're getting running a little bit out of time, so I want to make sure that anybody who put in a question gets it answered.
We do have another question here for both of them. Do either of you include notes or historical references at the end of your novels?
I absolutely do. I've learned all this stuff, and I need desperately to share it all. My first editor, the late great Michael Denneny, said to me, "David, you've mistaken what a reader needs to know to read a book with what a writer needs to know to write it, which is much more. You don't need all that. Just, you know." So I like sharing the knowledge after the fact of things that are like, oh, this is cool, but I couldn't put it in there.
I wish I had put historical notes at the end of mine, just so that people knew how much of that was actual, that these figures were actual. I did note that which ones were fictional and which ones were not in the beginning. But I am going to do that at the end of the second book, because this book only takes us up to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth getting together. And then the second book, goes on through to the end. And I want to put that because, yeah, you want to share this so that people, I was fascinated with your afterword with all of this information about the period and the people and who was real and all of that. I love that. And I was envious, and I shall do that in my next one.
Well, part of the reason it was there, and thank you, was because one of the lead figures is this historical person, Congrande de la Scala. I didn't want readers to think I had made up anything that he did. The insane stuff that he does in that novel, he did in real life. And I wanted to make sure that that was very clear. I was making up a lot of stuff, but none of that.
That's very cool. I'm just remembering Ken Follett. I think he has like two sets of characters, real historical characters and fictional in the front of his books. So that's interesting. Okay, maps in books. Okay, David's laughing. Okay.
My mother is here. She drew my maps.
Cool.
Thank you, Mom.
Okay. Okay. So
I do love maps, and I have a map, but of course, I wish it had like, 3 times the amount of detail, and I want to put all of these things in, and they're sort of like, no, just give people a general idea, where some of these big places might be. You can't put in I would like all of it. I would like a map that folded out like this and had everything in and the rivers and all of that, but you cannot do that. So yeah, I do love maps. And I see now they have things where you could let people make maps. You could buy little stamps. And so there's trees and mountains and stuff. And you can just kind of stamp your way to a map like that.
Yeah, Instagram was trying to sell me a map making service for writers the other day. Like you can create and put this thing in there. So I have a giant map of Italy, of northern Italy. Then I have a little map of the area around Verona. And then I have a map of downtown Verona. So I'm just kind of zooming in to the great places there.
And is it still possible to find historical maps?
I have one framed on my wall. So yes, somebody bought me a wonderful map of Verona from Italy that is historical, and it is framed on my wall back there.
That's very cool. Okay, Scotland, probably not so much.
Not so much. And much of it was, at this period was actually when it was kind of being coalesced, because you'd had the Pictish realms and Macbeth's territory in the north in Murray that he refers to. That was like Strathclyde, basically an independent kingdom, allied with Alba, but not legally really part of it, but allied and with intermixing royal lines. But at this period, with Macbeth becoming the king in the north, the king of Murray, and then becoming the king of Alba, he pulls those two together, and Malcolm had already pulled Strathclyde in. And so what we think of as Scotland came together in this period, but the western parts, the western islands and the western part of the country was all held by the Norse. So that part, the Hebrides and all of that was held by the Norse. The fact that they buried on Iona is because the Norse also buried their people there. It was a holy island. And so it was sort of, we're not going to hatchet up your boat if you come here with a dead king. This is going to be permissible.
Wow. Okay,
I just see some other questions over here. I don't want to ignore people.
Yes, we have a question. Val, will your second book include Malcolm's battle with Macbeth or end with that battle?
In Shakespeare, Malcolm sort of pops up and is immediately coming in to knock off Macbeth. Actually, he was a child at the time that Duncan died. Duncan died, by the way, because he was a really bad king, and he only lasted 4 years, and he invaded Macbeth's territory because he was not doing well as a king. He was unpopular. He kept fighting battles he lost. So he thought, I'll go beat up my cousin. And that didn't end well. But his son, Malcolm, was a child. And so he went away into fosterage, which he would have anyway. That was the standard thing. 7 years old, off you went to fosterage. So there is a battle with Duncan, of course, and there is the battle where Malcolm comes in to claim the throne of Scotland based on primogeniture. I was Duncan's son, and therefore I'm entitled to it. This was the big fight. The old Celtic method was by election. The best man won. The best one of the royal noble people was by election. And that's how Macbeth became king. Well, Duncan was coming in at the time when primogeniture was coming in. Malcolm thought he was entitled. So yes, he does come in with the help of the English. The English very much wanted to get their foothold in Scotland. And so the English, particularly the Northumbrians, backed 2 different invasions. First one, Macbeth is going to lose a lot of territory, regain some of it. Second one is the final battle. But I have much to do with Gruash around and outside of that, because she disappears from the record. So I get to do what I wish with her.
And this is one of the things that, like in Shakespeare's play of Macbeth, that Shakespeare gets right. It's Duncan upsets the great chain of being by announcing his son as Prince of Cumberland. He's my heir is going to be my son. His heir should be Macbeth. He just won a huge battle. He just won all this. He has showed himself to be a great warrior. He should be the next in line. But by bumping Macbeth down, he then takes away what's rightfully Macduff's, who's the Thane of Fife, who should be given the Thane of Cawdorship, all of that stuff. So Shakespeare's actually trying to do that little piece of that right. The sad thing, of course, is in Shakespeare's play, besides vilifying Macbeth, it also feels like it all happens over maybe 6 months.
Right.
And you want to speak to how long Macbeth actually ruled and what a great king he was?
He ruled for 17 years. And he was honored for being a Christian king. He was called the Righteous and the Ruddy King of Plenty. So he was a popular king and did well. And the arrival of Malcolm was actually, my next book will be called The Last Highland King, because Macbeth was the last Highland king. Malcolm comes in thoroughly anglicized and with the help of the English, and basically pulled the English into Scotland, from which they would never entirely give up. We were going to have all of this back and forth all the way through Braveheart and Outlander and all of the other things, is because the English feel like they're entitled to Scotland, and they're going to keep coming back and coming back. And it kind of starts with Malcolm Canmore.
Okay.
Thanes become earls, the first that ever Scotland in such an honor named. He says at the end of the show, he's taking something very Scottish and turning it to English.
Yeah. So he was kind of dealing with that, but very gingerly, because the whole thing with Banquo and the witches and all of that was because the chain going down to James was a little hinky in terms of who gets to be king and the royal lineages and stuff. And Banquo was to plump up that whole idea that you come from all the way back here, and these are, he had all of these sons going all the way down to you, and you're the king. So that was very much currying favor with the king, Banquo being totally fictional.
No, that's fascinating. Okay, I need to jump back to horses. I don't know why, but I do. So talk to me about horses.
Well, David's gorgeous horses. Why don't you talk about
this is my time, and knights on shining horses. And even in Roman times, if you owned a horse, you could rent a war horse. You could be considered a knight. You can enroll in all of this. But a knight is basically chevalier, which means somebody who owns a horse. And so it is about property and ownership and all of those various things. You had your riding horse, and then you had your war horse. You had a horse specifically bred to go into battle, and they would do things like armor their horses and put nails in the bottom of their horses' hooves so they could gore people as they reared up and kicked them. They had all sorts of fancy stuff. They even had a special thing. Now I've lost the name. For the horse's tail to go through that looks like a monster's head or something like that. So they made them as fierce as possible. So you had different horses for different purposes. Sorry?
I'm just saying they would have been Clydesdales, right? The huge.
Oh, yeah.
The huge.
Yeah, they're bred very much just muscles to batter people down and knock them down. And sadly, of course, your first thing, if you're on foot, the first thing you want to do and somebody's coming at you is kill their horse, because then you can get them down to your level. And so there's so many tales of stories of just what is horrific animal abuse in this era. Animals were seen as something other than, a living being. They were just very much property, and it's horrific to see what we do to animals in this time period. There's one sport that they had where they'd tie a goose by its feet between two second-story windows, and people would ride down the street trying to pull the goose's head off, and that was a game. And so the horrific things that we did for sport and to prove yourself, it's all bad. And so I feel terrible for these horses, and I try and show the awfulness without ever exalting it.
I think for my people, another reason why they didn't have charges and plate armor on horses, although they didn't have it, was that they didn't have big horses. The horses that could make their way around the highlands were tough highland, what we would call ponies, small horses, ponies, sure-footed, that could live out in the weather. I mean, this is the place where you got the highland cows with their hair hanging in their eyes, because it's rough out there. And it was not a place where you didn't have a lot of niceties for people, much less animals. So the horses were small. And even in the time of Robert the Bruce, the record of his times, they talk that he rode a little small palfrey. And this was a big man with a big sword, and he was riding a small horse because that's what they used in this time period. In Italy, the palfrey was considered the woman's horse. Yes.
It was the smaller horse for it. So it is totally just geographic on how horses are used.
And horses were valuable. So most plowing was done by hand or with oxen, not with horses. Horses were great for carrying things and carrying people, but they were valued. Whether they were treated well, I don't know. They didn't have some of the torturous kind of things that I think of a bit later. Maybe
because they're too precious. Because they're too valuable to abuse that way.
You also really didn't have cities in this time period in Scotland. You did not have population centers where people would have houses both sides where they can, hang up the goose in between them. It was a very, very rural culture. York was the nearest city. The rest were basically fortifications rather than what we think of.
Okay. Well, it's interesting. We're winding down here. You guys, I could listen to you for days. You're wonderful. And my very first question about how are you on historical correctness? Oh my goodness. I am so in awe of both of you for that. So is there, Susan, a last question we can sneak in, or?
The question is, where can they get their books and writings? And so in the chat, I have posted links to both David and Val's websites, and also a link to our New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society website.
Okay, so I guess last comments, wonderful authors.
Well, I just want to thank you for having me. This means so much. This is my first historical novel. I've written many other forms. This is my first. It's very, very special to me. And what a special event to be with you and David. David is magnificent. We could just go on and on. We need to share a pint together sometime soon, because it's just great talking with you.
Same, absolutely. I would talk Macbeth all day long. I've played him 17 times. So it's one of those roles that I keep doing. Hopefully I'm done, but we'll see. Yes, thank you all so much for having me. This was just an absolute delight. This is a lot of fun to talk about fun stuff. And the Master of Verona was my first historical novel, and it's really fun to return to because that's where my heart lives. It was one I poured most of myself into, and I love it a lot. So thank you all so much for giving me the chance to talk about him and Shakespeare. Okay, well, thank you, David and Valerie. You've been fascinating and terribly entertaining. Thank you, Susan and Faith, for doing the mechanics on this, and thank you for letting me moderate, because this was so much fun.
That concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society at our website, or contact us at info@hns.nyc.org. NYC.org. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites in the description. Thanks for joining us.